Good evening, everybody. We will just wait one moment while we're waiting for our audience to join our program tonight. We have a lot of people registered, so we'll just give everyone a minute to get on, and then we'll get started. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight for our virtual author program with art historian Dr. James Fox. He is joining us tonight for a conversation about his new book, The World According to Color, A Cultural History. His book was first released in the UK in October of 2021 and was just released in the US on April 12th of 2022. So we are so happy to have him with us tonight. His book, now I know they say don't judge a book by its cover, but I think you can't walk past this book and not be curious what it's about. It's so visually appealing. The book explores history, literature, art, and science to reveal humans' unique and vibrant relationships with color. Dr. Fox is joining us tonight from the UK. He's the Director of Studies in History of Art at Emmanuel College, University of Cambridge, and a British Academy of Film and Television Arts nominated broadcaster. His many acclaimed BBC television documentaries include programs about British art, Japanese culture, and an enduringly popular history of color in art. Copies of The World According to Color will be available for purchase from our local bookstore here in Hudson, the Learned Owl, and we'll go ahead and put a link to the chat in that in our chat if you would like to purchase a copy. As always, you, our participants, we always encourage you to put your questions for our author in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can put those in at any time and we will get to them shortly after our presentation tonight. So as I mentioned, the book just came out April 12th here in the States. I just finished reading it yesterday. I was lucky enough to get my hands on a copy. I have to say it was outstanding. And I think it has just tremendous appeal because it touches on so many different subjects. And that's why it's my privilege tonight to welcome Dr. James Fox. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late where you are tonight, so thank you. We appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, Alison, so much. It's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you all. Thank you for inviting me. And it's lovely to see, because I haven't actually seen the American copy of the book yet. So to see someone holding it is very exciting to me. Thank you.
It's beautiful.
Thanks very much. I mean, I should say, you know, this book has been such a labor of love for me. You know, I first conceived it back in 2012. And I thought, this is going to be a simple, easy project. It's going to be nice, write about a few colors. You know, as I started researching it, the subject became deeper and deeper. Every question that I answered raised another question. And it went on and on and on. And I think I ended up spending about 8 years of my life researching this book. So, but in some ways, I've been thinking about this book and writing this book since I was a child. And I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but it's something I write at the very beginning of the book, that I first really fell in love with colour when I was 6 years old. And there was a very specific event that I remember from my childhood. I was sitting in my parents' kitchen next to my brother and sister. It was a very hot day. And this fly came in the open window, very, very big fly, and rattled around the room like a kind of warplane. When it eventually landed on the kitchen table, my mum rolled up a magazine and just crushed it onto the table. And of course, my brother and my sister and I, we all did what any children would do. We leant in to examine the carcass, and this fly was spasming in body fluids, and we all went, oh, that's disgusting. But then I started to look more closely, and I noticed that there were these extraordinary colors on the surface of that fly. There were, you know, the thorax and the abdomen were these amazing sapphire blues and emerald greens, and the eyes were burgundy, and the wings looked like shimmering rainbows. And I remember thinking very vividly, if something as small and as insignificant and frankly as unpleasant as a fly could be this full of beauty and this full of color, then I've really got to start looking at things more closely. And that is what I did. you know, in the weeks and the months and the years that followed, I looked at absolutely everything, looked at the colors of everything. I counted the reds in the roses and the greens in the trees. I laid out leaves through the autumn in color-coded rows. I became fascinated in everything. But of course, the more I even discovered actually at one point, I think a few years after I first fell in love with colour, that if I went into a very dark room and I closed my eyes and I pressed my eyeballs, I could create all these extraordinary colours out of the darkness. They're known as phosphenes, actually, and they're amazing things. I highly recommend it to the people listening. But the more I focused on colour, the more questions there were. You know, the more uncertainties there were. You know, things like, you know, why was the sea blue but seawater colourless? Why did cooked beef turn brown and cooked chicken turn white? Why did we say that things like white spirit and white vinegar and white people, for that matter, were white when clearly they weren't actually, you know, white? And so it was that really curiosity about colour that led me to become an art historian, that led me to take on a job that involves me looking at colourful things for a living. And even today, every time I look at a great work of art, I do feel like I'm indulging this childhood obsession. But I suppose before I get started, I should try to answer the most fundamental question of all, I suppose, which is the question of what is colour? Now, it sounds like a simple question, but it's actually extremely difficult. As philosophers tell us, that the simplest sounding questions are always the most difficult to answer. But whenever I ask myself the question, what is colour? I'm always reminded of one of your US Supreme Court justices, Supreme Court Justice called Potter Stewart, who back in the 1960s had to rule whether a Louis Malle film, quite explicit Louis Malle film, whether it was pornography or not, whether it was obscene or not. And after some deliberation, he reached this conclusion, very famous today, where he said, you know, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. That's the famous line. And I think the same is true of colour. You know, we all know what colour is. Even my 3-year-old son knows the difference between green and red and yellow and orange. But when it comes to trying to define it, when it comes to trying to put it down into words, it's extremely difficult. And that is because ultimately, colour is an extremely slippery being that raises all kinds of really fundamental philosophical questions. And I suppose the most fundamental one is whether colour is a property of objects or of light, whether it exists out in the world, or whether it exists here inside our brain in the eyes of the eyes and the mind of the beholder. My own view, and we can talk about this later if you want, is that it's actually a bit of both. I actually think of colour as a process. It's a way by which our brains try to make sense of the chaos of light that surrounds us. And I thought I might actually try to, this is always a very nerve-wracking moment when you try to share your screen on Zoom, but I'm going to try and do it now. Let's do this now. Hopefully you have something there. So what, actually, I think I can probably do this slightly better. 1 second. See, I'm nervous for a reason about the screen sharing. Let's try this here. So do let me know if you can see the screen okay. But of course, one of the complexities, one of the problems with color is that, of course, it is so subjective. And so, you know, some of you will remember a few years ago, this photograph of this dress came up online, and it became this huge kind of online sensation, viral sensation, although I probably shouldn't use the term viral in that way anymore in light of COVID, because of course it became this sensation because this dress, although the world was looking at the same photograph of the same dress, they could not understand, they could not agree on the color of it. So lots of people thought the dress was blue and black. Lots of people thought the dress was white and gold. And so I think that became this perfect example of how subjective color is, how much of it is made inside the brain. And so it's therefore so difficult for us to try to get to grips with it. Now, of course, color isn't only a visual phenomenon. Color is something that affects our minds and our bodies in all kinds of ways. So for instance, colors help us understand when to wake up and when to go to bed, what to eat, what to buy, who to find attractive. They shape our emotions and the way we behave. We know, for instance, that red has an enormous impact on our minds and our bodies. We know that red raises heart rates, it increases electrical activity in the brain, it increases sexual arousal, it improves the body's speed, strength, and reaction times. We know that if you're wearing red, you are more likely to succeed in sporting events, particularly if they're combat sports. Whereas conversely, blue is a color that is far more likely to relax us. We even know there was a study done in Japan that showed that there were many that blue is associated with a reduction of rates of suicide. So colours have very, very potent effects on us. And what my book is about, as Alison has already said, my book is an attempt to look at the history of human culture through colours. And it runs really, it's 7 different chapters on 7 different colors. There's black and red and yellow and blue and white and purple and green. But I try to tell the broader story of human culture through that. So I begin with the origins of the universe, with the Big Bang billions of years ago. I end with the environmental crisis that we currently face. And I try to link each of those colors to a really significant archetypal theme, if you like, in human culture. Because human culture has always been inseparably linked to color. And we have used color since the beginning to communicate. We have used it as a symbol. We have used it as a language to communicate the things that are very, very important to us. And so I thought what I'd try to do over the next 25 or 30 minutes is to try to do a sort of potted history, if you like, of human civilization and color. Now, the first thing, that might be better. There we go. Hopefully you've got a slightly big, I was worrying why I wasn't getting bigger images, but hopefully now you can see them clearly. There is that dress. Interested to know in the text box whether people are seeing a blue and black dress or a white and gold. It is, by the way, actually blue and black. But if we go back to the very beginning, the first genuinely salient color in human culture is red. Now, that perhaps shouldn't surprise us, because although all of us come in many different surface colors, deep down we're all made from red meat. We're all kept alive by this red fluid, this extraordinarily potent red fluid that pumps through our bodies. And of course, if you go back to early creation stories, what you find is that so many creation stories from around the world stipulate that the first human beings were made from red materials, from red clay, from red soil. That is where the first human being of the Old Testament gets his name, Adam. Adam is called Adam because in Hebrew, Adam means in part red, because he was made from red material. And one of the really fascinating things about this is that it isn't simply a matter of myth. Archaeologists now for some decades have been going through lots of archaeological sites in Africa, looking at the origins of human society. And what they found in so many of these sites all over Africa is red pigments in enormous quantities. So we know that for well over 100,000 years, human beings were sourcing, excavating, processing, using, trading red pigments in enormous quantities. Now, we don't know exactly what they were doing with them. Some people have functional explanations, but anthropologists think that this red ochre, as we call it, this hematite, was being ground down into a pigment and made into a paint. And many of them think that it was actually being made into a paint by women, and that women were applying this red paint to their bodies to simulate, believe it or not, menstrual blood, and therefore to signify beauty and fertility. Now, of course, in some ways, this is still being done in certain parts of Africa. If you go, for instance, to Namibia, for instance, you will find there are the Himba women there in Namibia are still using the same ochre quarry they've been using for thousands of years, and they apply red pigments to their bodies, to their hair every single day. Now, this has, I think, three really remarkable implications, because if anthropologists are right, firstly, it suggests that perhaps the first sort of painting we did, if you like, was not on cave walls, it was on bodies. Second, that perhaps the first masters of this form of image making, if you like, or decorative work, and indeed colour production, were not men, but women. And third, it suggests that perhaps the very oldest visual symbol in human culture is the connection between red and blood, a symbol that, of course, is still very much out there today. And of course, by the time you get to the Upper Paleolithic, 30,000 years ago, we're even seeing some color coding going on. And this is a wonderful image from Chauvet Cave. I mean, one of the things that I find so fascinating about Chauvet and other caves like it is that while animals are typically depicted in black, so you can see that curved black line there is actually a charcoal line that delineates the back of a bison. While animals are depicted in black, human forms tend to get depicted in red. So after that artist has drawn that bison back, that artist, or maybe another artist, deliberately chose a new color, red ochre, to depict the human hand stencil. So already there is a sense, even 30,000 years ago, that humans are somehow identified with red. Now, it's important to say that, in prehistoric times, they didn't have many colors to choose from. They had blacks, charcoals that they burnt from wood and bone. They had white chalks if they were lucky. They had some yellowy brown ochres and umbers, but essentially that's all they had. They only had the earth colors to work with. It was only really in the ancient world, in the Neolithic world, that they started, these great emerging civilizations started to create all these new colors like vermilion and indigo. And in China, they invented a color called Han purple. And in Egypt, they invented a color called, Egyptian frit. So it's only in the ancient world that we begin to see these new colors emerge. And many of them became very, very luxurious. And so one I thought I might show you as perhaps the most luxurious, the most extraordinary of all of these ancient pigments, dyes, was this one. It's called Tyrion Purple. Now, Tyrion Purple, as the image suggests, was made from shellfish. It started to be made about 1500 BCE in the Near East. And what you would do is you would catch a shellfish, you would crack open the shell, you would pull out the hyperbranchial gland, you would squeeze out this tiny amount of toxic mucus. You would then simmer that mucus in salt water for a week or two. And by all accounts, I mean, it was the simmering process released the most unbearable stench. Someone said it was, I think, a combination of rotting flesh, garlic breath, and excrement. But that simmering process also produced some of the most extraordinary colors that range from sky blue through to scarlet, through all these wonderful purples. Now, it was a labor-intensive process. You needed 9 or 10,000 shellfish to produce just a gram of the dye. You needed to kill 9 or 10,000 shellfish for that much dye. And that made it eye-wateringly expensive. Now, I found during the course of my research a 4th century Roman price list. It's called the Edict on Maximum Prices, compiled by Emperor Diocletian in 301 AD. And essentially, it's a list of all the prices of all the commodities available in the Roman Empire. And it says in that list that a pound of Tyrion purple silk, so a kind of handful of Tyrion purple fabric, cost 150,000 denarii. Now that was twice as expensive as gold, 7 times as expensive, 75 times as expensive as saffron, 5 times the price of a slave. So you could buy 5 slaves for the price of a handful of purple silk. And in fact, there's only one item on the whole price list that is as expensive as purple silk. And that, believe it or not, is a lion, a male lion that had to be captured in Africa and brought alive all the way through to Rome. So I hope that really gives you an impression of how expensive, how exclusive colour and this purple could actually be. And of course, the Romans became so obsessed with this purple that the authorities had to regulate it. So we know that Nero, for instance, he closed all the shops that sold it. Caligula took control of the dye works that were on the coast of the Mediterranean. And it very quickly became an exclusive symbol of the emperor himself. So here you can see Justinian, 6th century Byzantine emperor, wearing this Tyrion purple robe and looking very proud of himself in the process. And of course, by this stage, if you were to be found to be buying or selling or wearing or even owning in a sort of drawer behind a bed or something some Tyrion purple silk, you could be charged with treason. That was a crime punishable by death. Now, of course, different cultures prize different colors. So if, for instance, you went east, if you went to China, red was one of the most highly prized colors. Red was seen as a particularly auspicious color, a really good color of good luck. And you can see in this wonderful dish from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, it's a dish that is surrounded on all the sides by symbols of good luck, and in the middle, this character that grants long life. So red was associated with good luck. And I think that's still very much the case in Chinese culture today. Chinese people still celebrate the new year with red lanterns. They still put red paper on their door to ward off bad spirits. You still, if you have a baby, you give them red clothes to wish them well in their life. If you buy lots of Chinese products, if you buy Chinese chili oils, and my household is particularly fond of Chinese chili oil, they often come in red labels. Chinese restaurants often have red signs because it's good luck. In fact, the connection between red and good luck in China is so entrenched that China, in fact, is one of the only countries in the world whose stock market shows rising stocks in red rather than black. So, China had very different views, not purple, but red. Whereas if, for instance, you then went to the Middle East, if you went to the Middle East, into the Islamic world, it was green that reigned supreme. So we know, for instance, that it was said to be Muhammad's favorite color. We know from texts like the Hadith that Muhammad often wore green clothes, that he often talked about how much he loved green vegetation. We know from the Quran that paradise itself is described as green. It's filled with green vegetation. It's a garden. It has green cushions. The people who live there wear green clothes. And not many people know, in fact, the shortest verse in the whole of the Quran is just one word long. And that word means green. It describes the particular kind of green tree that you can find only in paradise itself. And if you travel through the Islamic world from the Alhambra in Spain in the west all the way through to Jaipur in the east, through the Middle East and North Africa and Central Asia, what you find is the most extraordinary greens. In fact, I do think that Islamic artists have always been the masters of that wonderful area of color space that exists between green and blue. So aquamarines and turquoises and teals and lovets and eggshells and those kinds of colors, because they're trying to simulate the kind of idea of a well-watered garden of paradise. And here is one of my favorite paintings from the Islamic tradition. It's a wonderful little Persian picture from the 16th century. And it shows a great Persian hero called Rostam. He's asleep in the woods. A lion poses a threat when his loyal steed fights off the lion. But of course, what this artist has really focused his attention on is the vegetation. Look at the abundance of vegetation. Look at the beauty with which it's been painted, the care with which it's been painted. Look at the enormous variety of the myriad greens. And I don't think European artists got to this stage for much, much longer. This is a culture that really understood green in the Islamic world. But if we move to Europe, I suppose, I think that in Europe, the color that really emerged with most credit in the Middle Ages was blue. Now, blue is a really odd color because, it is now the most popular color in the world by a country mile. Every country that's surveyed, blue is by far the favorite color. And yet it played a very marginal role in human society for a very long time. And I think that is actually because it is actually, if you think about it, quite scarce in nature, at least on a physical level. There are very few naturally occurring, easily accessible blue minerals out there. There are very few blue plants. There are very few genuinely blue flowers. And though you might think of a number of electrically blue, insects or birds or amphibians, they actually, most of them simulate the idea of blue through modulating their surface structures. So I'll just skip out of screen share just for a second, just to show you this. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. This is one of my favorite items. This is a Ulysses Butterfly from Australasia. And as you can see, it's extraordinarily blue. However, when scientists started to examine this butterfly with a microscope, what they found out that it does not contain any blue pigment at all. This butterfly is brown. It is brown, and it simply creates an illusion of blue by having all these scales across its surface, Christmas tree-shaped scales that knock white light out of phase into our eyes and make us see it as blue. And for those of you who are proud of your blue eyes, I'm very sorry to break it to you, but blue eyes, human blue eyes, do not contain any blue pigment at all either. I'm just going to share my screen once more, because we have in the world about 64,000 vertebrate species, and so far scientists have only found 2 of 64,000 that contain any blue pigment at all, and that is 2 species of the calanimid fish. This is one of them, the Mandarin fish. And of course, what this means, of course, from a cultural perspective, is that for a long time, it was really, really difficult to make good blue colours because they weren't available naturally. And so by the time you get to the Middle Ages, yes, we had indigo and woad, these 2 blue dyes. We had azurite, which came from the Alps. We had cobalt blue, which was often used in those beautiful stained glass windows in France. But none of the blues were quite right. And it was really only in the second half of the Middle Ages that we developed in the West the sort of greatest, if you like, blue pigment of them all. And I'm sure lots of you know this is from the stone Lapis Lazuli. Now, for much of history, this stone, Lapis Lazuli, could only be found in one quarry under one mountain in one very, very remote part of Afghanistan. And of course, to get it to the west, you had to load it onto mules, you had to take it across the Silk Road through Merv, it went over the Persian mountains, down through the Mesopotamian plains, it was loaded onto boats at the ports of the Levant, sailed up the Adriatic, and then when they got to Venice, which is where much of this ended up going, the merchants would hide it in pockets, in their secret pockets in their coats, because the import duties were so great. But that was only the beginning, because then, of course, what you needed to do was to try to turn this very impure stone into a blue pigment. And that was extremely complicated as well. And it's around 1200 that a very convoluted recipe emerges that involves grinding down this stone into a powder, mixing it with resin and gum and wax and linseed oil to form a dough, kneading the dough for several days, submerging the dough in a lye solution, and then working that lye solution until only the blue bits came out. So it was a very long process. But of course, once it was done, it produced what is the most famous pigment probably in the history of art. It was called by the Italians azzurro ultramarino, which meant overseas blue. Overseas because the stone came from a long way away. We call it ultramarine. And ultramarine, like other exotic products like Tyrion Purple centuries before, it did not come cheap. Ultramarine was 100 times more expensive than most other pigments on the market. I found one data point actually of a Florentine artist called Andrea del Sarto. In 1515, he paid 5 florins for an ounce, just an ounce of ultramarine. And I calculated that a labourer living in Florence could have rented a house for 5 years for the price of just 1 ounce of ultramarine. But it was, for many artists, worth it. And of course, for us in the UK, the most famous use of ultramarine is in this utterly extraordinary barnstormer of a painting, Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne at the National Gallery in London. Of course, it captures the explosive moment when Bacchus, in the middle of the canvas, who's leading this ragbag of revelers, first sets eyes on a heartbroken Ariadne on the left. She's just been abandoned by her lover Theseus. She's heartbroken, but Bacchus sees her. He falls in love with her. He marries her on the spot. He turns her into a deity like himself, and they're all happily ever after. So it's a romantic and exuberant painting, but its enduring popularity is really owed to its colour. Because what Titian did, he got a very, very big down payment from his patron. He went straight out and he bought the most expensive pigments, the most expensive colours that money could buy in 16th century Venice. So, for instance, the green in the trees, that's not any old green. That's malachite green. That's malachite green, which was brought all the way from Egypt. The finest crimson is used in Ariadne's sash. In Bacchus's cape, the finest vermilion is used in Ariadne's sash. The woman with the symbols with the orange top, that orange top is made from realgar and orpiment, two extremely exotic, very expensive, very toxic arsenic-based pigments that came all the way from China. But the greatest colour in this painting is without question the ultramarine. You see it in the sky, you see it on Ariadne's cloak, you see it on the dress of the Bacchante. It covers about a third of the canvas. And scientists think this is the purest ultramarine that they have ever seen in the history of art. And just, the material alone would have cost an absolute fortune. Now, many people at the time condemned Titian's use of colour. In fact, there's been a long tradition in European culture, going back to antiquity, that has a problem with colour, that sees colour as trivial, as superficial, as immoral, as something that's more about enjoyment than virtue. And of course, it was definitely enhanced, this suspicion, in Titian's time with the rediscovery of antique statues. Now, we know that, for instance, the Greeks and the Romans, they made lots of marble statues and temples, but they covered them in bright colours. But of course, over the centuries, those colours faded away. And when those monuments and sculptures were rediscovered by medieval and Renaissance Italians in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, most of the colours had gone, and they presumed that those statues had always been sort of white, not really white, but white marble. And because they revered everything associated with antiquity, they decided that if they wanted to be classy, they had to do the same thing. And that is why, for instance, Michelangelo, who was present when one of these statues was dug up in Rome, why he really liked to make his sculptures from the purest white Carrara marble. It's why his successor in many respects, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, did the same. And I show this image because I still, having looked at this sculpture for many years, still cannot understand how he was able to carve something that looks so soft and supple from stone. But at the same time, this effect is enhanced by the quality of marble. Not many people know that marble is porous to light. So when light hits marble, the light doesn't bounce off it. The light goes inside it. It penetrates it for several millimeters. It then bounces around in the calcite crystals and then comes out in all different kinds of directions. It's something we call diffuse refraction. And this is something that other organic products have. It happens in our flesh, organic diffuse refraction. It happens in milk. It happens in blood. And so, in a way, marble does lend itself to these sort of supple, organic visual qualities. And of course, this love of the whiteness of things, it goes beyond sculpture, it goes into architecture, it spreads beyond Europe, it goes to the United States. And I think even today, we do have this prejudice, we do have this sense that whiteness is a color of purity, of grandeur, of virtue associated with classical antiquity. We still think there is something classy about a sort of minimalist white interior. And I'd say that this aversion to colour in some ways, the moment when it started to be overturned, I would say, is really in the 18th and 19th centuries, because that is the period when the new discipline of chemistry, interacting with industrialization, if you like, begins to produce all kinds of new synthetic colors. And I think it leads to, the greatest revolution in color production probably since ancient Egypt. All these new colors emerge, and perhaps the first of, I would say, great synthetic pigment was this one. It's called chrome yellow. Chrome yellow was invented very early in the 1800s after the element chrome, which of course the word means color in Greek, was discovered in a Siberian gold mine. And it was this extremely potent yellow, much brighter than all the other yellows available on the market at the time. And it became the yellow of the 19th century. It was used to paint houses, to paint coaches, to color confectionery. It became the yellow that Vincent van Gogh used in his famous sunflowers, and we still use it today. We still use it today to paint yellow lines on roads. It's still the color that colors the yellow taxis and cabs in New York. It's a dominant color. But perhaps the first artist to really embrace it in the 19th century was one of my countrymen's greatest painters, Joseph Mallord William Turner. As you can see from this cartoon, Turner was very much at the time associated with yellow. He was called the Yellow Dwarf. He was obsessed with yellow in all its iterations. And he was particularly fond of yellow because he was fond of painting the sun. He was a great sun worshipper in that sense. And he found lots of different ways to paint the sun, little dots, little squiggles. This is perhaps his most famous sun in the UK. It's a very hazy sunrise, Norham Castle. Something, I've looked at this painting many times over the years, and I've always wondered how he was able to create this extremely evanescent sunrise, a sunrise that you almost can't see. Hopefully, even over your screens, you can sort of detect that kind of shimmering quality of the sun. And I only a few years ago realized the way he was able to do this was something called isoluminance. Now, if you look at this painting in black and white, what you'll see is the sun is basically invisible. And that is because it is exactly the same lightness as the sky around it. And neuroscientists say what that does is it means that one part of our brain that perceives color is easily able to see the sun because it's easy to say, yes, see yellow against blue. And the part of our brain that is looking at value or tone is unable to see the sun. And that creates this conflict, this battle taking place inside the visual system that means that yellow sunrise seems to vibrate on our eyes. And Turner was probably the first to use this method. But Monet, of course, famously does it afterwards. Very highly visible red sun in the sunrise there, but in black and white, virtually invisible. And that's why that sun is also very difficult to look at. But speaking of difficult suns to look at, this is perhaps Turner's most impossible to look at sun. And I just very briefly tell you the story of this picture because it's pretty remarkable. This is a painting called Regulus, and it's about this Roman general called Marcus Attilius Regulus, whose army gets defeated in Tunis in 255 BC. He gets captured by the Carthaginians, and they tell him he has to go to Rome to secure the release of some Carthaginian prisoners. So Regulus goes to Rome. He advises the Senate not to make the deal, then wisely, bravely, or perhaps I would say kind of crazily, returns to Tunis and tells his enemies that the deal has not been made. Now, they don't take the news very well, so they decide to punish him, and they punish him by cutting out his eyelids and making him stare into the bright sun until he gets slowly and very painfully blinded. And then they put him in a barrel full of nails and he bleeds to death. But the extraordinary thing about this painting is that Turner isn't depicting Regulus. He's trying to show Regulus's point of view, what it's like to stare into a bright yellow sun. And, it really did have its effect. When this painting was shown in the 1830s, critics advised people to keep a safe distance from it or to look at it through their fingers in case they too got blinded. Now, we're into the 19th century, and I'm just going to talk for 5 more minutes or so, because I think, no colour was revolutionised, I think, more in the 19th century, not so much yellow as purple, and that it all came down to this extraordinary lucky invention in 1856 when a young man, he was 18 years old, called William Henry Perkin. He was making some experiments in his parents' spare room, trying to synthesize quinine, which at the time was the only known effective treatment for malaria, when he, by mistake, created this wonderful purple color. He persuaded his father to part with his lifetime savings, and they built a factory and they started producing this purple color called mauve. And this color became an absolute sensation almost overnight. Queen Victoria started wearing it, the aristocracy started wearing it, the middle classes started wearing it. I mean, by the 1860s, it was on everywhere. Ribbons, scarves, postage stamps, sweets, suits, school uniforms. You could not move for it, both in the UK and all over the world. And you know something, it also kick-started a great new era for the creation of synthetic dyestuffs. Really, from that point on, from 1856 onwards, barely a week went by without a new synthetic colour hitting the market. The next big one after mauve was magenta in 1859, but one after the other, after the other, after the other. And you know something, we often think of the past as being less colourful than the present. And I wonder whether that's because we mostly see it through sepia photographs and black and white films. But if you had gone back to London or Paris or New York in the 1860s, you would be astonished by the colours and by specifically how purple it actually was. And of course, it very quickly feeds its way into art. So you begin to see purple very absent from the history of art until the 1850s. Suddenly, you see it everywhere. And you see in this wonderful painting by Ford Madox Brown, magenta, this other very beautiful synthetic colour, becoming extremely prevalent. This is a scarf that took a ribbon that took Ford Madox Brown 4 weeks to paint, just the ribbon alone. So you really see an extraordinary emergence of bright colours in this period and bright purples in this period. And of course, after the pre-Raphaelites, the Impressionists take it on. The Impressionists start getting very interested in purple. And there's a reason for that. The Impressionists and the post-Impressionists like Seurat, this is a painting that's very local to you in Chicago, or relatively local. I know that local in the States is very different from local in the UK. But the Impressionists had this one great ambition. They wanted to try to paint the brilliance of light as they saw it in the most naturalistic way. But there was a problem. And the problem was that the dynamic range of paint is a sorry, pathetic fraction of the dynamic range of light and shade as we see it in the world around us. And so they knew they would never be able to do that with black and white and greys. So they decided that instead they would try to simulate the brilliance of light through colour. And that's why they start putting purple dots in the shade and their opposite yellow dots in the light to try to create, through the explosive quality of complementary colours, the shimmering sense of light itself. And of course, their love of purple didn't go down very well. There were lots of critics. There were lots of people who said, purple is completely inappropriate in the history of art. Now, of course, as we move into the 20th century, there were many different purple sort of monomanias of colour in a way. And I'm sure lots of you can think of artists in the 20th century who have particular connections to particular colours, whether it's, Gustav Klimt's gold, or Henri Matisse's red, or Ad Reinhardt's black, or Mark Rothko's reds, that there are these colours that particular artists became particularly interested in. Some artists, in fact, were so kind of obsessed with the colours that they invented new ones. And of course, the most famous example of that is the great French artist Yves Klein, who spent several years inventing a new blue, which he patented under the name International Klein Blue, before applying it to pretty much everything he could get his hands on, including naked women. Now, I just want to conclude very quickly here. I've got lots more to say, but we can hopefully cover it in the questions. But I just wanted to bring it up to the present day, really, and say that, today's world is saturated with color. We now think there are about 40,000 dyes and pigments on the market, with more of them appearing all the time. And I think that as a result, color has become so common, so cheap, that we take it for granted. I often think of an example of my son's box of coloring crayons. And I sometimes look at that box of coloring crayons and I think, 200 years ago, a product like this, which essentially takes all the colors in the spectrum and lines them up and makes them available for you to use, that would have sent emperors and alchemists into raptures. Artists would have traveled hundreds of miles to get hold of a product like that. People might have fought wars over boxes of coloring crayons, and now it can barely keep my son entertained for more than a few minutes. And I think that, we now have so many colors at our disposal that we have run out of sensible names for them. You just have to go down to a sort of home decorating shop and see the silly names. We've got a company here called Farrow and Ball. They've got colors called Elephant's Breath on the market. And so, I think that I'm not quite sure whether it's a good thing or not. In some ways it's a wonderful thing that all these colors that were once so rare and scarce and exclusive are now available to everybody democratically. But on the other hand, I think we have lost perhaps some of the magic, some of the aura that once they had. Anyway, we'll leave it there in the hope that we have some time for some questions afterwards. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Yes, we do have questions. Thank you. That was fascinating, and I'm sure we'll get some more questions in the Q&A. I was curious, while some of our audience members are putting their questions in the Q&A, in your research, was there a color that was particularly more interesting for you to research?
Well, actually, there were some colors there were colors that I wasn't that keen on researching at the outset. I wasn't particularly interested in researching purple, I thought, and lots of people said, oh, don't do purple. But actually, purple became one of the most exciting research components of the book for me. Obviously, my favorite color going into the book was blue. That was the color of the chapter I wrote first. It was the color I was most interested in researching. But in a way, the color that I found most, the color that I sort of emerged from the book loving the most was black, astonishingly. So, yeah, there was everything was interesting. That's the thing about color. You can always find something interesting to say.
One other question, and you might have just answered. I was wondering, I'll share my screen really quick. So do you have any input in what your book covers look like?
It's very interesting to compare the British cover to the American cover. The British cover, they decided to go very austere, and they said, well, there you are, that's very interesting. Yeah, there you go. On the left is the British cover. They decided we're not going to do a rainbow cover. We're going to go for one particular color, and it's going to be blue, and that's going to be the theme of the book. And they went for a painting by Yves Klein, and it's very kind of cool and austere in that sense. And then the American publisher, St. Martin's Press on the right, just decided to go hell for leather and just put all the colors on the cover. And so two very different approaches. I think I love them equally, actually. I was given a couple of options both times round. And actually, no, I was given no choice by Penguin on the left. They said, this is the cover. And I was, by my wonderful American publishers, given a choice between this and another cover, and this is the one I chose.
Great. All right, well, we'll take some audience questions. We have several here in the Q&A. A couple of people asked about if your book touches on color blindness at all.
Yeah, it does. I think that color blindness is that color vision is a fascinating topic. We often think of we often think that we humans have excellent color vision, and it's certainly true that we have better color vision than most mammals. So for instance, if anyone in the audience has a pet dog or a pet cat, they are red-green colorblind. They can't see red and green. Bulls, although, we often think of bulls as being enraged by red rags, bulls can't see red. So we've got very good color vision for mammals, but compared to most other animals, we are extremely colorblind. Birds, fish, insects have much better color vision than us. Bees can see ultraviolet light. Snakes can see infrared. They can actually see the heat that emerges from their prey. There's a particular animal called a mantis shrimp, which has 12 dimensions of color vision as opposed to our 3 dimensions of color vision. So we are colorblind compared to lots of other animals. We are blind to a huge part of the spectrum. But of course, within humanity itself, as I said, men are far more likely to be colorblind than women. And we do think that there's a very small percentage of women, probably only 2% of women, who have a 4th cone cell. They have a 4th dimension of color vision, which means they can see perhaps up to millions more colors than everyone else, although they don't necessarily know who they are. Maybe they are among us in the audience. They don't know who they are because, of course, it's very difficult to compare your perception of the world to someone else's. But yes, color blindness plays an important role. Monet is an artist I discussed in the slideshow. Monet slowly went colorblind towards the end of his life as well, and that shows in his paintings.
Interesting question from Sue. She asked, during your research, did you create a color map to track specific colors with specific cultures and or history around the world? If so, what did that color map look like?
I didn't sort of make an actual map, but the book itself is a kind of map. The book itself is a way to see how the meanings of colors transcend, although color meanings obviously change all the time. They're context specific. There are certain meanings that are transcending time and place. And so you find, for instance, various sort of archetypal associations. So black and darkness, red and blood, yellow and the sun, blue and the sky, green and vegetation, white and purity, that do actually you can map them across the whole world, and you can map them across centuries as well. They do seem to stick around. So I do think there are certain meanings of color that are, I won't use the word universal, but almost universal. But then there are other color terms that's impossible to map. Color meanings, because they're constantly changing. I'll give you one example. If you, for instance, went into a funeral in a black dress, that black dress would be a symbol of mourning. But if you then took that same dress, wearing it, and jumped into a taxi and went to a cocktail party, the black dress would become a symbol of chic sophistication. And so the meaning of the color changes within the space of a moment, just simply by changing context. So some things are easier to map, some things are very difficult to map.
Was there any rhyme or reason of how you divided the colors in your book? So each chapter is on a different color. You started with black, ended with green. Was there any reasons why you put them in the sequence you did?
Yes, there is. First of all, I wanted to have 7 colors because 7 is a particularly symbolic number for humanity. We talk about the 7 days of the week and the 7 ages of man and the 7 sins and so on and so forth. And lots of previous theorists, Aristotle, I'm not comparing myself to Aristotle or to Isaac Newton, but Aristotle and Isaac Newton like to divide the spectrum into 7. And so I wanted 7 colors, and then I arranged them to tell this broader story of humanity. So black begins with the origins of the universe. It begins with the Big Bang emerging from darkness. And then I wanted to end with green because it has that environmental message. It goes from, as I say, the origins of the universe through to the prehistoric emergence of humanity, the rise of religions, then into the great age of exploration during the medieval and the Renaissance period. Then white is about the Enlightenment. Purple is the Industrial Revolution, green is us and the environmental movement today. So it does have a sort of chronology to it.
Edward asks in the chat, are there a core group of colors that have led to the range, and are we definable by the color we like? I think you mentioned that blue was the most popular color. About 40% of the population blue
that is
indicate that blue
true.
is a favorite color. So are we definable by the colors that we like?
It's certainly true that it's a fascinating thing how consistent the popularity of blue is around the world. So in the United States, yes, it is over 40% of people call blue their favorite color. But it's also true that societies are, and certainly people's preferences for colors, sometimes they're very personal. They might be linked to your own childhood and a particular color that is, was given to you by a parent or you were dressed in. That might also create an aversion to a color as well. But we're also defined in our color choices by our society. So, in the Islamic world, as I said, people are far more likely to like and to revere green within the Islamic world. People are far more likely to cherish yellows in South Asian culture, in Hindu culture and Buddhist culture, and far more likely to dislike yellows in Western culture. So I think the colors that we historically kind of are drawn to and are opposed to do reveal something, not just of ourselves as individuals, but of the societies we come from.
Now we have a couple questions in the Q&A, and I think if you read the book, some of those questions will be answered. One, Linda asked, please talk about black. And black is the beginning of your book. And you talked a lot about the debate between, is black actually a color or is it not? So I think if you read the book, you might be able to answer some of those questions. I'm sure you don't want to give everything away in your book, right?
No, but I think, yes, there's a big debate, big section in the book about whether black is the thing that actually took me longest of the whole book to research. It took me months to research that question of, when we look at black, what are we looking at? Are we looking at darkness? Are we looking at nothing? Is black the same as silence? Is it a nothingness thing, or is it a positive sensation? And so I sort of spent months and months trying to work out what it is. What I concluded, and I'm not going to reveal too much, is that darkness and black are very different things. In fact, the color of absolute darkness is gray, not black. That was one of the things that's a surprising discovery for me.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. It's actually, we'll ask Cathys' question here. Cathie noticed the framed images that you have on the wall behind you. She said they are very interesting. Colors, except for one, orange, are rather brownish, blackish, and white. What drew you to those images?
Oh, well, this one over here is a bright red tree given to me by an artist I know and love. This is a piece of a drawing of a bark. In fact, one of the things I should say is that my home is pretty, for someone who likes color, this is virtually the only really colorful thing in the house. Mostly it's kind of monochromes of, pale woods and some linens and things like that, because that's my wife's taste. But yes, that's one of the few bright colored things in the house, and it's actually made by an artist who appears in the book towards the end of the book.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time. I know it's almost midnight where you are, so thank you so much for your enthusiasm. Again, the World According to Color is available for purchase courtesy of Learned Owl. Link is in our chat if you would like to purchase your copy. And Dr. Fox, thanks for your time tonight. And thank you all of our audience for your great questions. Always happy to hear what our audience has to say. So thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.